Origin of the conflict. On February 24, 2022, troops of the Russian Federation carry out a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The aim of this operation is to overthrow the Ukrainian authorities and install a government in Kiev that is more pliable towards Russia, which task will be to adopt a pro-Russian course in foreign and domestic politics. This act is intended to be the first step towards reincorporating the Ukrainian state into the Russian sphere of influence, from which this nation escaped after the Maidan independence revolution. The next stage would be an attempt to annex the young state entity, exactly as is the case with Belarus, which independence is currently illusory agreement. On August 24, 1991, the Parliament of Ukraine announces a declaration of independence. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a large part of the USSR's nuclear potential was located in the former Soviet republics, Belarusian, Kazakh and Ukrainian. It is estimated that Ukraine alone had an arsenal larger than that of Great Britain, France and China combined. However, it is not known whether Ukraine managed to gain control over it and what its possible range was. Opinions on this subject were divided among experts. Some of them, including Władysław Orlov, claimed that the Ukrainian authorities only had a negative control, for example, they could stop a launch of ballistic missiles, but did not control the warheads themselves. Based on the Lisbon Protocol, signed on May 23, 1992, by the USA, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine and Kazakhstan, the three previously mentioned former Soviet republics joined the START I Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty and thus assumed the obligations of the former USSR arising therefrom. Under separate agreements, these countries also committed to join the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as non-nuclear states, at the same time declaring the return of all warheads to the successor of the USSR, the Russian Federation. Belarus was the first to join the treaty in 1993, and at the beginning of 1994, the agreement was ratified by Kazakhstan. However, the situation of Ukraine was completely different. The authorities of this country were afraid of losing sovereignty, both territorial and political, to their eastern neighbor, and, in exchange for returning the warheads, they expected guarantees of their independence and territorial integrity signed by the Western countries and Russia itself. Those concerns were the result of protracted disputes between Kiev and Moscow over the status of Crimea, the division of the Black Sea Fleet, and the discourse regarding the eastern borders of the new state. The delays were interpreted in Kiev as Russia's reluctance to make the young political entity independent of its larger, dominant neighbor. It was therefore hoped that the nuclear arsenal, remaining under Ukrainian control, would have served as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the Russian Federation and the West. The fate of former Soviet republics, such as Georgia and Moldova, was also taken into account, in a hope that it would have had a deterrent effect on Russia and cooled down its possible attempts to annex Ukrainian territory. Safety. On July 1, 1993, the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine sent Vladimir Tolupko's proposal to President Kuchma, which was a development of the Tolupko speech to the parliament in April 1992. During his speech, he stated that Ukraine's accession to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons would be romantic and premature. In the previously mentioned document, he also states that, in the interest of national security, there is no alternative but to retain nuclear weapons as a part of Ukrainian armed forces. Guarantees. The Ukrainian authorities demanded a security guarantees from the US in exchange for the return of the nuclear warheads. These were supposed to be guarantees that America's closest allies usually receive. This meant that an attack on the Ukrainian state would be treated as if it was an attack on the territory of the United States itself. However, the Americans were not interested in making such commitments and only expressed their willingness to issue a political declaration, which was not supposed to have legally binding force. This position was then communicated to the Ukrainian side. The Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine was very cautious and skeptical about the idea of returning nuclear weapons without binding security guarantees from the Western countries and Russia. Therefore, ratification of the START I treaty was made dependent on both parties meeting a number of conditions intended to ensure the continued existence of the young state. On January 14, 1994, in Moscow, as a result of the agreements reached, a tripartite declaration was signed called the Trilateral Statement by the Presidents of the United States, Russia and Ukraine, in which the fulfillment of the previously mentioned conditions was declared. Ukraine was also to receive, as a compensation for the warheads, fuel assemblies containing 100 tons of low-enriched uranium for its nuclear power plants. The US also agreed to pay $60 million to cover the cost of neutralizing the transferred weapons and producing the rods. They also agreed to pay Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia and Ukraine $800 million to cover technical costs related to disarming the warheads, storing fissile materials and operating the entire project. At least $150 million of this amount was to go to Kiev. Budapest Memorandum. On February 3, 1994, President Leonid Kuchma obtained Parliament's approval for the exchange of ratification documents of the START I program. However, the case of joining the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons was different. For the next few months, the authorities in Kiev had been protracting the process of implementing the declaration of January 14, 1994, wanting to obtain the best possible guarantees for the new state. Unfortunately, Western European countries and the USA were not willing to extend these guarantees, and Kiev's isolation on the international arena began to grow. Finally, on November 16, 1994, the Verkhovna Rada voted to allow Ukraine to join the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons as a member that does not have this type of arsenal. The condition, however, was that it would take place after written confirmation of the security guarantees by the countries possessing such weapons. On December 5, 1994, in the capital of Hungary, Leonid Kuchma submitted the ratification documents, and on the same day, representatives of the USA, Great Britain, Russia and Ukraine signed the so-called Budapest Memorandum. The 6 paragraphs of this document essentially repeat the obligations arising from the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe and the United Nations Charter. The memorandum does not include any guarantees that would oblige Western countries to provide military assistance to Ukraine in the event of a violation of the provisions of this document by the Russian side. Without such obligations, the document became only a political declaration and is treated as such by most practitioners of international law. Taking this into account, it can be noted that Ukraine replaced its real security, which was nuclear weapons, with another one in the form of guarantees from Russia, Great Britain and the USA, non-binding, declarative and without consequences in the event of failure to meet its conditions. The conclusions that can be drawn from this fact seem obvious. The source of conflict. Pro-Western turn. Pro-Western turn of Ukraine after 2004 and the Orange Revolution caused concern among the Kremlin authorities, who feared losing influence over their Western neighbor. Ultimately, this could result in Kiev falling out of the Russian sphere of influence. Ruski Mir was shrinking more and more, and Georgia had already left this zone after the Rose Revolution in 2004, and 2 years later Kyrgyzstan followed the same paths as a result of the Tulip Revolution. Russian minority. The next source of conflict was certainly the Russian-speaking minority, which was approximately 8 million people in 2001 and lived mainly in the southern and eastern parts of the country. Moscow used it as a pretext during its intervention in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, which declared independence as People's Republics in 2014. Then, predictably, By Vladimir Putin's decree on September 30, 2022, they were incorporated into the Russian Federation. Friendship. Ukraine is perceived by the authorities in Moscow as a rebellious republic that managed to gain independence at the time of Russia's weakness. This impression can be seen, for example, from Vladimir Putin's article of July 12, 2021, published on the official website of the President of Russia, Kremlin.ru, which was titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians." The date of the article publication was certainly not an accident and was one of the elements of preparations for the intervention in Ukraine. In this article, Putin claimed that the Ukrainian state owes its current shape to Soviet Russia, thanks to which it received territories taken from Poland, Romania and Czechoslovakia. Those gifts were given as a proof of friendship, but since Kiev was no longer friendly towards Russia, it would be necessary to return to the borders of 1922. Later in the article, the President of Russia also raised the issue of forced Ukrainization of the Russian population living in the area subordinated to the authorities in Kiev. This was another pretext used later to sanction the attack carried out by the Russian army on Ukraine. Crimea. In 1954, Nikita Khrushchev, then first secretary of the CPSU, transferred the jurisdiction over Crimea from the Russian to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialistic Republic. This transfer was intended to strengthen brotherly ties between the people of Ukraine and Russia, he said. That move was a pure propaganda, because no one at the time even suspected that Ukraine might cease to be a part of the USSR and the Union itself would stop to exist. Nevertheless, since the collapse of the USSR, many Russian nationalists have demanded the return of the peninsula, which is strategically important to Russia because of the naval base in Sevastopol, which is the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. Fallen Empire. A sentiment for the fallen empire, still presented among the Russian elites, also played an important role in the entire history of the outbreak of the Ukrainian conflict. Many local politicians were deeply convinced that allowing Ukraine to break away from Russia was a historical mistake, while Kiev's subsequent drift towards the west was seen as a blow to Moscow's prestige on the international arena. The pro-Western attitude of the Ukrainian authorities was one of the pretexts used by Vladimir Putin when the special military operation was announced. Hydrocarbons. Gas has also become one of the flashpoints and essentially its price for Ukraine itself, as well as the cost of transiting Russian raw material to the West. The conflict related to this escalated throughout the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, reaching its peak in January 2009. On December 31, 2008, the previous agreement between the two countries on gas supplies and transit expired due to the lack of consensus regarding new price rates. A day later, Russia completely cut off gas supplies to Kiev, and on January 5th, supplies to Moldova and European Union member states were limited. A day later, on January 7th, Russia completely turned off the flow of gas through the Druzhba pipeline. Fuel deliveries were resumed only on January 20th, after both countries signed a new 10-year-long contract. First movement. Ukraine's rapprochement with the European Union, which took place at the end of the first and beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, meant for Russia at least partial loss of influence over its western neighbor. This fact was not wanted to be recognized by the authorities in Moscow, who were rather interested in increasing that influence to such an extent that Ukraine could finally be included back into the Federation. For this reason, under pressure from Russia, the President of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, abandoned plans to tighten relations with the EU. This decision was the direct cause of the outbreak of dissatisfaction among citizens, which then turned into a nationwide protest against the corrupt authorities in Kiev. The uprising was later called Euromaidan, after the name of the square in the capital of Ukraine, where mass protests of Ukrainians supporting rapprochement with the West took place. Its result was Yanukovych's overthrow, who then fled to Moscow, thus confirming the identity of his principles. The fact, obviously, did not please Kremlin decision-makers and was described by Putin as a Western-backed fascist coup. Commentary. Getting rid of nuclear weapons by Ukraine solely on the basis of non-binding declarations from the Western powers was a cardinal mistake. Countries such as Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states or Finland, if we are talking about Europe, neighboring a state pursuing an aggressive external policy seeking to subjugate its neighbors, should not base their existence on international treaties only. History, including the recent one, shows that all interstate agreements are worth exactly as much as the willingness of the signatory states to comply with them. It didn't matter that Russia had guaranteed Ukraine's territorial inviolability if, almost 30 years later, it decided to completely ignore these guarantees, making up absurd pretexts for doing so. Pretexts, let's add, that could be heard earlier in our modern history, uttered by other dictators. One can only speculate at this point whether the Russian Federation would take such aggressive military action in the face of the Ukrainian nuclear arsenal. Nevertheless, it would certainly raise the stakes of aggression itself. Taking the above into account, it should be firmly stated that the previously mentioned countries should prepare their defense strategy for their own statehood as if they had no external guarantees. This may turn out to be just a meaningless piece of paper.